howdy. Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. Really great. Totally terrific show. Briahna, let's talk about it.
Well, first up, Robby, Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg has been making the rounds across corporate media as the Biden administration attempts damage control on political fallout from this month's derailment disaster in Ohio. Buttigieg told reporters on a call he would eventually visit East Palestine, quote, when the time is right, and even admitted to CBS News he had regrets about the administration's initial response.
And I just have to ask, because it did take you a couple of days to respond publicly, or several days to respond publicly to this particular incident. Do you wish you would have spoken out sooner?
Yes, I was focused on just making sure that our folks on the ground were all set, but could have spoken sooner about how strongly I felt about this incident, and that's a lesson learned for me.
Then over on ABC's Good Morning America, Buttigieg had some stern words for the rail industry.
There's another side to the story, which is making sure that we move forward on rail safety in this country. The NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, is an independent body, and they are independently doing their investigative work. But we don't have to wait for their final report to know that some things need to change. And so today, we are pushing forward a three-part drive on rail safety. Things that we're doing at the Department of Transportation to raise the bar, things that we need help from Congress to do in order to hold rail companies accountable, and things that this industry needs to do differently. I got to tell you, ever since I came into this job, I have seen the power that multi-billion-dollar railroad companies wield, and they fight safety regulations tooth and nail. That's got to change. The future cannot be like the past, and I am calling for that change to begin right away.
You're beginning saying.
And it doesn't end there. Buttigieg also hit out against Marco Rubio after the senator from Florida called for his resignation. He accused Rubio of getting too comfy with rail industry barons, tweeting, quote, "The facts don't lie. The 2021 letter you signed was obviously drafted by railroad industry lobbyists. It supports waivers that would reduce visual track inspections. Now, will you vote to help us toughen rail safety accountability and fines or not?"
Yeah, it's interesting. So Buttigieg is completely right. A number of Congress members signed this letter. It was included down beneath the tweet, asking for basically lower standards for the kind of inspections that might have caught the fact that there were, sparks shooting out from under this train for apparently 20 miles or so before the actual derailment. Fair enough. But when I listened to that Buttigieg clip, I was also struck by the interesting deference he kept making to the NTSB, the National Train Safety Board, talking about how it's an independent organization. It's independent. We have to let them do what they want. So I thought to myself, is that actually him properly deferring to the authority of an independent body to conduct an investigation? Or is it a little bit of him also ducking responsibility? And when I looked into it, it became clear. David Sirota covered this over on the Lever, I believe, and also on his Twitter page, that the NTSB actually recommended to Barack Obama back in 2014 that they adopt safety rules covering the exact kind of compounds that were involved in the derailment in Ohio. So the NTSB can do its job. At the same time, a year later, Obama regulators decided to side with lobbyists and ignore NTSB's demands rather. So at the end of the day, if the NTSB doesn't actually have the authority to implement the kind of safety regulations that they would actually recommend, ultimately I found some of his framing in that clip to defer to the NTSB, to be kicking the can of responsibility down the road in a similar sort of way to what Marco Rubio was doing as he's demanding action from Democrats, et cetera, at the same time that he was part of the problem as well.
Right. When government is functioning properly, regulatory agencies, authorities are not supposed to just craft new rules or stop enforcing rules or change course. Congress is supposed to give them clear directions on what the new rules are supposed to be, and then they enforce them. This isn't unique to this industry whatsoever. This comes up in all sorts of areas. I've looked at it most closely in the rules for higher education around expression and due process and things where you have aspects of the education department coming up with new rules, and then the schools don't want to follow them because they don't know if they're law or not because Congress hasn't weighed in. Now, unfortunately, we have a reality where Congress doesn't weigh in on enough of this stuff anymore because Congress doesn't properly function, but it leaves a lot of regulatory authorities actually in the lurch when they're kind of making up rules and it maybe exceeds their authority, which is not to say that more rules aren't necessarily needed. It's just the agency that's supposed to be doing that is the Congress, and they're not doing it.
Well, sure. I mean, but in this case, the rules were the recommendations were issued. The Obama administration at the time declined to adopt them, and so this is my issue with this. Everybody is engaging in point scoring to a greater or lesser degree in this situation. But there were things that happened during the Obama administration that led to this crisis. There were things that happened to the Trump administration, specifically choosing not to force the rail industry to adopt the new technology on brakes. They're currently using these air brakes from like the first decade of the last century that because they act sequentially down the car cause that slinky effect that forces derailments when the new electronic brake system that has all the cars stop at once electronically doesn't have that, ricochet effect. That was a Trump era policy. So again, I'm just deeply skeptical of anybody's real investment in fixing the problem if we get Democrats criticizing Republicans and Republicans criticizing Democrats. I trust people who are willing to offer a critical lens on the failures of their own party. Fundamentally, the world is not that simplistic. Obviously, you have to parse what people are saying and look at their records and things like that. But I'm immediately suspicious of people in a situation like this who are pointing fingers that doesn't also reflect back on the people that are currently in leadership. Mm-hmm. The fact that Pete Buttigieg can kind of go through the morning shows with impunity and not be asked pretty embarrassing questions about what impact Joe Biden had on crushing this rail strike, when part of the demand of the workers in the context of the rail strike we were talking about at the end of last year was to have more staffing on these trains, was to have more capacity to do inspections on these trains, was to have days off so they weren't tired and exhausted and were able to actually check if everything on these trains, which, to be clear, almost 2 miles long, was actually in order.
I was actually reading an interesting report from the director of research at the Brotherhood of Railroad Signalmen, which is a union for people who work on the railways, Christopher Hand. He was saying that they don't have enough time to check the hot box detectors, the software that, or whatever, the device that detects whether the wheels are overheating, which is exactly what happened in this case. The wheels overheated, and East Palestine got some last-minute warning that the wheels had overheated. The question, why didn't that warning take place earlier? Was there some kind of malfunction? But so this is a union person saying they don't have enough time to do these inspections because they're doing too much government-mandated training and work of that kind, which actually prevents them from doing the work that they need to do.
Okay, well, I listened to a lot of, that might be true. It is also true that the rail industry has been pushing to go from 2-person manned trains to 1-person manned trains, and that the rail industry workers would prefer if there were many more people able to actually staff the trains.
Because at the end of the day, they were left alone to do their work.
At the end of the day, the trains are 1.8 miles long. The train that derailed was 1.8 miles long. There were 3 people on this train because there was a trainee, a conductor trainee. But generally speaking, you're looking at a situation where a train, how long did it take to walk about 2 miles? About 40 minutes. And that's if you were just walking and not actually conducting an inspection and trying to have critical faculties at play. So people are being asked, using this PSR, the primary complaint, this is the first time I'm hearing that. I don't deny that, of course, I've got administrative things in my job that make my job difficult. Everybody does. I have some skepticism that given that what we know about the brakes, what we know about the staffing, and what we know about union members have been saying for months now, years now, it's been 3 years they've been arguing around this contract, that the primary issue here is the fact that there is cost-cutting quarters by these train companies who don't want to pay people a living wage, don't want to let them have a break, partly because they have this PSR, precision railroad scheduling, that makes it so that they are able to make a lot of money by having incredibly tight schedules that don't allow for any kind of personnel changes. And until we get to the bottom of that, again, we're going to have 1,000 derailments a year, just like we've been having. And I'm afraid that this is going to kind of sink back into the back of our minds, because not every derailment is accompanied by, a 1,000-foot plume of smoke and toxic chemicals that captures the public imagination.
Yeah, well, make them pay for it. They should pay for all the damage they cause. I think that's the right thing to happen. Companies that cause massive destruction or loss of life, they should pay for it. And that will hopefully disincentivize future risky behavior, disincentivize the kind of cost-cutting, et cetera, the not following proper safety protocols, that would be the way to disincentivize for them from doing that.
But out of curiosity, we've talked a little bit about the fact that there are these, the statutory cap for damages in like $250,000, something that's very minuscule. At the same time, we know that the damages from these kinds of cases often don't manifest for years, decades even. The nature of toxic chemical exposure and carcinogens can be very far out, and that raises a huge causation barrier for litigants who are trying to prove that this incident caused their cancer. It's very, very difficult. And the reality is that as much as you and I both agree that the train companies should pay, historically the reason why behavior never changes is because they don't actually have to accommodate, they don't actually have to pay for the full cost of the damages that they've caused, because the legal system advantages rich corporations because of their ability to have legal
I support changing the legal system to unlimit the liability.
But it's not about limited liability. It's about the legal system itself disadvantaging average people who are put in a situation where they, 20 years down the line, have to prove that their laryngeal cancer had anything to do with a toxic spill 20 years before. It's just a very difficult burden for them to meet. And moreover, they don't have the same resources to pursue that kind of litigation that the corporations do. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. We can both sit here and say the corporations should pay, but the corporations know, in all likelihood, they're not going to have to.
I mean, they should pay for the cleanup costs associated right now. I don't know.
But not that's
well, those
the problem,
things are difficult
right?
to prove. I mean, and there are people who claim they get sick later in life. It has to do with some kind of environmental harm, and you can't necessarily adjudicate those things.
And
they're hard to do.
Problem. And that's
Havana
the problem.
syndrome, et cetera, and over again.
I don't think that when you look at communities like the ones around 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania and a million other dumping sites and toxic events around the world, the people who've been suffering and dying in Ecuador because of the Chevron spill in the Amazon, that you can kind of say, oh, well, this is probably imaginary. Who knows what's going on here? The reason why some of these are successful, we all watched and loved the Erin Brockovich story. We've seen people in these communities know exactly what's happening to them. The question is whether the court system is adequately designed to force corporations to internalize the risk. And many people, including a law professor that I interviewed for an episode of my podcast that'll be coming out tomorrow, explain why just fundamentally it's not well suited to that task. So it raises the question about whether or not we should be raising the statutory caps and making them statutory minimums for what these people have to pay out, because otherwise it's not clear to me that there's going to be enough of a penalty to get them to curb their
the
behavior.
downside of doing all that, though, raising their regulatory costs, their regulatory burden, that they pass those costs on to everyone else. They fire more people. They don't just eat that. I mean, people working in America need these jobs. They've
cut their staff by 30% in the last 10 years.
But they're going to cut it by even more the way we're headed.
Right. So you can actually impose.
Yeah, so you can beat up on the companies that provide working class people with the jobs they need, or you can try to find some way to structure the legal system so that when an egregious harm is perpetrated, the people who do it pay for it.
So one of those ways to restructure the legal system that some people argue for is to have a strict liability standard. And until I believe around the 80s with a Richard Posner decision, it was the case that when you were transporting very hazardous materials, the law said, look, if you want to deal with an extremely risky behavior and profit off of extremely risky behavior, if something goes wrong, you are strictly liable, meaning that no matter what, if there was, something outside of your control, whatever it is, you have to pay. What Richard Posner did was switch it into a negligence standard, which means that, hey, if a deer runs across the tracks, if something happened, you have to prove that I was actively negligent in order to recoup anything from me, which again is another way in which the legal system again and again and again is changed so that all of the risk and burden go on the American people and on the public and never on these corporations. Because this line that seems to work on everybody is that corporations are the most vulnerable constituency in the world and we have to protect them at all costs or their jobs are going to go away. Meanwhile, Americans are dying as a consequence. And America didn't used to be this way. And frankly, these industries used to be thriving and more of a share of their profits used to go to the people that actually made them great.
All right, we got to leave it there. We'll have more Rising right after this. Stay with us.